There are a lot of games now. Back in the PS2 era, lots of games came out, but if you kept on top of print magazines and the early gaming websites, you always kind of knew about what felt like 90% of the stuff that was coming out. But now, there are a lot of games, and you'll never keep up. So, out of the nearly infinite amount of options at your disposal, how do you choose what to play? If you're like me, you follow a few websites or podcasts, but you also know which developers make your favorite games. And maybe you get more granular than that and follow specific directors. Maybe you have a favorite YouTuber or even Twitch streamer. But even then, you still just cannot know about everything. And then what do you do in those moments where you want to play something, but you're not really looking forward to anything in particular? What grabs your attention in those moments? For me, it's usually a cool art direction or something that just looks unique, but then there are those moments where I'm looking just to play something low impact, something campy, something stupid, or just something light and overall fun to play. That's how I felt when I saw the trailer for Stranger of Paradise. Above all else, it just looked dumb. Prince of Persia Warrior Within dumb. And from the moment that I saw the trailer, I knew that I just had to play this dumb, loud game, but nothing could have prepared me for how dumb it was, but also how fun it was, and ultimately how much I ended up liking it despite a few flaws. For the uninitiated, Stranger of Paradise is a Final Fantasy spin-off with its full title being Stranger of Paradise, Final Fantasy Origin. And after a few scenes play out, it becomes apparent that this game is taking place in the world from the original Final Fantasy game, with Corneria being the starting city. There are some stark differences at the beginning of this game when compared to the original Final Fantasy that lets us know that we're not playing a rehash of the same story. For one, the princess being kidnapped is not the first event, at least in terms of plot progression, and we now play as Jack, a named character this time around, and the other three Warriors of Light, as they are tasked with restoring the four crystals in order to vanquish the omnipresent threat of chaos. But in these early chapters of the game, the story really kind of takes a back seat to our new protagonist, Jack. Jack is interesting for a few reasons. His design, for one, is really some new ground as far as Final Fantasy protagonists go. Typically, the series has gone for racially ambiguous and androgynous young men, decked out in clothing that kind of rides that fine line between high fashion and the trashy side of Harajuku streetwear. Jack, on the other hand, is aggressively masculine and shockingly Caucasian, almost Aryan, really. And he is dressed down compared to this franchise's standards. Although he does rock the deepest Henley shirt I've ever seen. I mean, look at these buttons. What purpose do these buttons serve? Outside of his design, he is terse, angry, and obsessive about his mission. And it's a mission that he simply will not let you forget.
When are we gonna fight Chaos? All I care about is seeing Chaos dead. Looks like Chaos has been waiting for us. Chaos. He's out there. I can feel him. My mission is to Chaos.
Jack must kill Chaos, to the point where it's comical. I don't think I've ever seen a character in any medium this, horny to kill an antagonist. And what makes it more strange is that there is never really a clear motive for this, at least on the onset of the story. Jack wants to fuck Chaos because he wants to fuck him. It's really that simple. Jack is so single-minded in his conquest that he is short with his companions.
Let's bring an end to this empty dream.
Bullshit.
He's even shorter with any enemy who steps in his way.
I don't give a fuck who you are!
And side characters get no real love from this gruff man, and whenever he's found himself fed up with other people, he retreats into his only other point of character development, which is listening to bad new metal on his out-of-place smartphone.
Bullshit.
He's a weird character, and although the game does go places and he gets fleshed out, he is this way for the vast majority of the game. And I love this character. Jack is a video game character through and through, in an era where storytelling in games has gone to the point where it no longer needs to be legitimized to non-nerds. Jack represents the unadulterated super aggro power fantasies of the PS2 era. And I just seriously haven't seen a character like this since, I guess, Asura's Wrath. And speaking of Wrath, Jack is just as aggressive in combat as he is with his comrades. The combat is fast, hard-hitting, and every combo string is punctuated with a canned wrestling move or just stylized ultra-violence. Jack is equal parts Travis Touchdown and Doom Guy in combat, and I found it to just be this loud, stupid, cathartic mess. At the risk of falling into the meme, I'm not going to mention the game that obviously inspired part of this game's combat. It's clear. I don't have to say it. You fight with the shoulder buttons, the perspective is the same, you level up and heal and reset the world when you reach these cube things. We all know what this is. But comparing this game to the game that seemingly all action titles are compared to nowadays does this game a bit of a disservice and kind of misses the point. Team Ninja developed Stranger of Paradise, so if there is a game that this title shares a large chunk of its DNA with, it's Nioh. But if you were to zoom out further, this is not a game of exploration where danger awaits around every turn. It is a game in which you experiment with classes and builds in order to figure out how to lay as much waste as possible. Think Diablo 2, where leveling up your class is just the beginning, and then outfitting that class with the proper gear to min-max your synergies is really the end game. This focus on builds, loot, and experimentation is both Stranger of Paradise's biggest strength and most glaring weakness. On the one hand, there are nearly 30 classes, all of which unlock new abilities and combo chains, all sharing from a pool of 8 weapon classes. This allows for a lot of really good experimentation early on. Are you having trouble with getting close to an enemy that deals too much damage? Try blasting it from long distance as a black mage. Want to get into the thick of things and parry with a shield? There's a class for that. Every class has a unique skill, like the Thief's ability to steal quick use spells from enemies. And if you needed a little bit of health regen as you fight up close, try the Warrior's Warcry. All of these classes have ties to the Final Fantasy series in some capacity, and not only is it cool to see them represented in this fast-paced action game, but they translate to this game's style in such a way that it left me thoroughly impressed. On top of experimenting with classes, every single one of these jobs has passive buffs that come into play whenever a new affinity threshold is met. Some of these are unlocked through just leveling up the class's skill tree, but if you want to hit those higher thresholds, that's where this game's gear system comes into play. Most items that you find have a corresponding affinity, and if you stack them in the proper order, good things happen. There is an insane amount of gear in this game. And as you play through the campaign the first time, the optimize button is your best friend, as there is hardly a way to keep up with all the new stuff that is constantly trickling in. All these have different rarities, some of them come equipped with abilities or effects, but for the most part, you can usually deck out your character throughout the story by stacking on the highest level gear. And with missions always having a recommended gear level, this becomes the default way of outfitting through your progression. Sure, you could go through every piece of equipment, completely maximizing your build, but at least through the story playthrough, I found no real use for this, especially since I was constantly switching between classes just to see what the game had to offer. The one thing that was undeniable about the system, though, is that the design of some of these pieces are awesome. A lot of these look really cool, and you could definitely lose yourself in optimizing not only for your stats, but also giving into the aesthetic side of character building. But with the way that I played through, constantly switching gear around, I always found myself excited to see the next cutscene, as it meant that Jack was going to be screaming about fucking chaos again, but this time in a dumb new hat.
We're going up.
I love this. All of these choices, the classes, the gear, the appearance, they're all great, and there is so much room for experimentation, but the real downside is none of it is ever truly necessary, not until you get to the endgame. And while I'll talk about that in depth a little later, I truly didn't find myself interested after I saw the credits roll. Stranger of Paradise exists in this weird place where it's just as dumb and loud as I've mentioned before, but there's a lot to love about the combat and systems, and the story starts off as one note as possible, but eventually develops into something that had some real emotional beats. The whole experience has this stripped down feeling, and when coupled with its lackluster graphics, highly repetitive gameplay, and hyper-masculine power fantasy moments, Stranger of Paradise really gave me the impression that this was something that could have been released as far back as 2009. This isn't a complaint, though. Some of my favorite experiences in art and media have these rough edges, with Drakengard 3 being my favorite game of all time. Stranger of Paradise actually reminded me a lot of experiences like that. It was equal parts Drakengard 3, a spin-off like something like Persona 5 Strikers, and a PS2 throwback to something big and dumb like Gungrave. And it also falls into that really special place of Final Fantasy spin-offs like Type 0, where we have this M rating, it's a little bit more brutal than normal, but fun to play all the same. Stranger of Paradise isn't the most serious game to come out of Square Enix recently, but to its credit, I was never bored with this game. The list of games that I've dropped in recent years to what I call the Ubisoftification of games ever since things like Assassin's Creed 2 and Far Cry 3 came out is massive. These are formulas that seem to recoup losses, and as games become more and more expensive to make, it often feels like your two choices are to play something big, beautiful, and ultimately bland because of how derivative it is over last year's title, or you could go the indie route and look for the next diamond in the rough. The B game is harder to find nowadays, and unfortunately for me, that's always been the space that I've had the most fun in. But Stranger Paradise is a B game. It's not trying to dazzle with anything that hasn't been done on a technical level for the better part of a decade now, but it's fast, it's fluid, stupid, fun, and in some crucial moments, heartfelt and well executed. And where the story of this game started as something that could have been considered meme territory, it did wind its way into something that felt impactful, subversive, and while clumsily executed at times, consequential, and in some ways consequential to the entire Final Fantasy series at large. The original Final Fantasy is not the most discussed game nowadays, and while that makes sense considering everything that's come after, it did have a relatively interesting story, especially for the time that it came out. Sure, it involved all the obvious fantasy tropes such as elves, pirates, and dwarves, crystals, and knights, but there was a sci-fi bent there from the very beginning, and a neat plot that included things like time travel in order to create a closed time loop that kept the antagonist all but immortal. At the risk of spoiling some of the plot, skip to the timestamp on screen if you want to be left completely in the dark, but just know that if you've seen the final trailer of this game, it outright says some of what I'm about to say. By the end of this game, it is revealed that Jack's surname is Garland from the original game, the antagonist who kidnapped Princess Sarah in the original game, and the antagonist that merged with the entity known as Chaos to become the main villain of Final Fantasy I. So, true to the title, this game does serve as an origin point for that original game. Over the course of this game, we get to discover the reason that the original time loop existed, Garland's motivations for merging with Chaos, and the creation of the Four Fiends, and ostensibly why the world was in flux at the onset of the original adventure. Jack goes through a lot of character development through the story, and by the end of it, I found that a villain that was once considered to be one of the more one-dimensional in Final Fantasy history now had one of the more entertaining backstories. Garland is now vindicated, and in some ways, even noble for his actions. Even if the path of how he got there is a dumb and convoluted mess, it was a mess that I really enjoyed. It's crazy to see a game from 1987 get retconned in such a way, but by the end of it, I felt that the way that the original game had been recontextualized in such a way where the original game now gets to exist in this bolstered status. Even though the plot of Stranger Paradise is told in a strange and disjointed way, journal entries and codexes become basically required reading for getting the most out of this experience. And while this is something that I don't typically enjoy at all, it works here. But the actual beats of this story work in such a way to motivate, excite, and actually turn Jack into a character worthy of the series that birthed him. I went into Stranger Paradise for a good time, something I could turn my brain off while I mash buttons, and I definitely got that. But I also got a game that looked cool, made me laugh, and had a story that ended up being far more interesting than I would have expected. The game also serves as a love letter to the original game by taking locations, characters, monsters, and moments from the original Final Fantasy and has extrapolated them in such a way that the series is now better off than it was before this game existed. There are some weak moments to this game though. Opaque storytelling, constant combat, and realistically a weak endgame. Upon beating the game, you unlock Chaos difficulty, fitting for sure, and I just did not see the point after unlocking this. I played through the entirety of the campaign and loved it, but then suddenly the game switches its focus. Now the game goes from being a fun hack and slash experience to a brutal one hit does half your health bar affair. And this would be cool, but if you want to actually beat every level on the ever increasing difficulty, you now have to play more deliberately than you've been trained to. And at this point, you have to start selecting gear based off of affinities more than anything to get the most passive buffs possible. I played for about 30 hours of what I felt was like a cool action game, just to find out that this was the tutorial for a much more unforgiving game, with almost no new content. And I just couldn't get myself to care. It struck that Skinner box part of my brain that Diablo 2 Resurrected did, and I had to call it quits. This isn't to say that this makes the game bad, this part just wasn't for me. But the highs of the rest of the experience more than made up for it. And now, with Square Enix pushing out games like Voice of Cards and Stranger Paradise, I am starting to see a glimmer of hope from the publisher. I grew up loving the more esoteric parts of their catalog, things like Drakengard and The World Ends With You, and between these recent dives back into the more experimental, I'm looking forward to the future with things like Forspoken, another Voice of Cards game, and now hopefully maybe another Final Fantasy Origins game. I'm excited for the future with Square Enix. Now if we could get Square Enix to do the Atlas thing and get a third party to develop a dope 2D fighter like P4A with all their characters, that would be super rad. Especially if Jack Garland were to be included as a playable character, so I can show my friends and all people online just how good I can fuck Chaos.
Chaos.